The gospel today addresses several different things. First of all, in Jesus' time, it was still thought, and as some of us today still kind of say at least, that if something happened that was tragic, it was because this was God's punishment on you. So that's why he zeroes in and says, okay, those Galileans that were killed by Pilate, and then he took some of their blood and mixed it with the sacrifices, you think they were the worst sinners? And then Jesus says, well, of course not, but you'll all end up the same way unless you repent. And then the 18 who died when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. There was a collapse of this tower that was part of the wall around Jerusalem, and 18 people were killed when that happened. And so again, the question gets asked, were they that bad that this happened to them? So he's challenging that idea that bad things happen to bad people and only good things happen to good people. The whole book of Job dealt with that mystery to start with. But what Jesus is getting at is, I think, really in the second part of the parable today. Beyond the idea of people have things happen to them because things happened to them, not because they were being punished somehow. But when he talks about that fig tree, after about 3 years of a tree being planted, fig tree in particular, it should have been bearing fruit. But the gardener stays the hand of the owner and says, well, give it another year, while I hoe around it and manure it, do everything I can to help it be ready to bear fruit. And then if it doesn't happen, then you can cut it down. So in the midst of dealing with the awareness of personal sin, and personal sin that is not being punished by some divine retribution, Jesus also brings forth the idea of God's patience and God's mercy, and, in a sense, God's compassion for lives that have not been bearing fruit. Because God could just as easily do away with this person, these people, who aren't bearing fruit. Think for a minute of that whole experience of the Exodus. Moses is going through his moment today of vocational encounter with God. And that God reveals the ineffable name, I am who I am, or that I am. I am now makes himself known. But even in the midst of that, Moses is getting the call that he, in spite of having been this murderer, which he was, which is why he escaped to the land of Midian out of Egypt, that he is being called by God. He's not being punished, but rather he's being called. Being called, not that God said, well, it's okay for you to murder an Egyptian, here or there, but, don't do it very often. He doesn't say that what he did was right, but he says that there's no reason for him to be condemned because God doesn't see as people see. God sees what's in the person's heart. He knew what was in Moses, and he knew that by this call, by this guidance, by his presence with Moses, and entering into really what turns out to be throughout the book of Exodus, and as we see it reflected again in Deuteronomy, this very particular kind of relationship of friend to friend, more than God to person, but friend to friend, that Moses encounters. And that's because God forgave what he had done and was patient with him, more patient with him than he really needed to be. And that patience was reflected towards the Israelites, who were not the easiest people in the world to lead. And as we know, on a couple of occasions during the Exodus, Moses has to tell God to chill out. You know, hey, wait a minute. You don't want to get the reputation that the only reason you brought us out of Egypt was to kill us off here in the desert. Just think of all the bad press you're going to get. Back off, you know. And so God listens to what Moses has to say. He calms down, as it were, so that the people are again given an opportunity to bear fruit. They're given an opportunity to grow and to change, just like God had given to Moses himself. And just like the parable of the fig tree today tries to convey, that God takes the approach with sinners that they would be better alive, that they would have an opportunity to repent and to grow and to change, which is basically what St. Paul reiterates in the letter to the first letter to the Corinthians, the second lesson today. Because he knows that we are weak. God knows that we can very easily forget who we are and whose we are. We can slide right back into old patterns really fast, even though our hearts are saying, we want God, we want to live a different life. But yet, the old patterns, the old relationships, the old ideas are still very powerful and can pull us back and blind us, really, to what it is that we are supposed to be seeing and how we're supposed to be living. But as Paul says at the end of the reading today, he will also give us a way out. He'll not let us be tempted beyond our strength to endure, and God will always provide this way out. And the way out is forgiveness. The way out is admitting that we need to be forgiven. But there's a little more to this, which is the fragileness of life and how quickly life can end. And because of that, the need for us to really live in such a way that we are ready, as much as we can be, to say yes to the Lord when the moment comes. Those people who died there in Siloam, the 18 who were crushed by the falling tower, if they were right with God in that moment, there was nothing for them to fear. Similarly, those that were put to death in the beginning of the gospel passage today by Pilate, if they were ready to die, then there was nothing to fear for them. And it's not that we need to walk around like, is today the last day, or is this moment the last moment of my life? But it's a good thing for us to be reminded once in a while that life can end quickly, abruptly. Think of the Chicago police officer off duty who, after being out at night with friends, ends up dead by the shooting that took place. Or a priest friend of mine up in Canada who had been having some health problems but was pretty much assured that he had a number of years ahead of him. And he began to feel kind of awful at the end of the Divine Liturgy one Sunday morning in February and drove himself to the hospital, and he died. Presumably he was ready. And then today we remember St. Oscar Romero, who was the Archbishop of El Salvador, San Salvador, in El Salvador, and the martyrs of El Salvador. And Archbishop Romero, even though he had been threatened with death any number of times, was cut down just about the time he finished his homily in the Sisters' Convent Chapel the day before the Feast of the Annunciation on the 24th of March. If you ever want to hear something that's really kind of off-putting, listen to the recording of his speaking, and all of a sudden, it's done. And he died practically right away. We are called during the season of Lent to be aware of who we are and whose we are. To be aware that God has called you and me to be part of his holy people. That we do not know how long we have to live. We may, all of us here, have many years, relatively speaking, ahead of us. Some of us here might not. But all of us have the call to live as the holy people of God. To live each day as it is a gift from God. To be grateful for it. And to try to live in such a way that if we would die that day, that we would be in the hands of God. That we would not have anything that we would really need to repent of. I guess I'm more attuned to this because of the loss of this friend of mine not long ago, who was just several years older than I. And also because, the older we get, the more of our contemporaries precede us in death. And, what used to seem like being years off comes awfully close. And so to be aware, to not be afraid of that reality, but to be prepared and to live a life of spiritual integrity is not a bad thing, no matter how young or how old we are. And I think this is why, on this third Sunday of Lent, we can give thanks that the Lord doesn't say, cut it down. Why should it clutter up the ground? But rather, I'll leave it for one more year. I will continue to give you the opportunity to grow, to change, to mature, to bear fruit. So the Lord, who is patient and merciful and compassionate, is here in our midst this morning once again to nourish us, to feed us, to strengthen us, and to call us to continue to walk the faithful journey and to know And no matter what happens, He's with us.